The smallest act of kindness can return wearing the face of destiny. The lunch break was supposed to last exactly 30 minutes, just enough time for Elena Bennett to escape the endless fluorescent lights of the downtown accounting office before another afternoon of numbers blurred together. Instead of joining her co-workers at the crowded cafe across the street, she walked 2 blocks farther, carrying the homemade turkey sandwich she had packed the night before along with a bruised apple and a bottle of water. Autumn had settled over Manhattan with crisp air that carried the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and the distant echo of sirens blending into the city's familiar rhythm. The small public square offered a rare pocket of quiet surrounded by towers of glass and steel. Office workers hurried past with expensive coffee cups while tourists studied maps they barely understood. Elena chose the same weathered bench she always did, overlooking a fountain whose water shimmered beneath pale afternoon sunlight. That was when she noticed the older man sitting alone near the edge of the plaza. His coat had clearly survived too many winters. His grey beard was neatly trimmed despite everything else about him suggesting hardship. Most people avoided looking in his direction. Some walked faster, as if poverty itself could spread through eye contact. Elena watched him lower his head for only a second before reaching into her lunch bag. She hesitated long enough to remind herself that she could always buy another sandwich later if she had to. Then she stood and crossed the plaza. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Would you like this?" "I packed too much." The man slowly looked up. His blue eyes were surprisingly sharp beneath tired wrinkles, carrying a quiet dignity that caught her off guard. He accepted the sandwich with both hands as though it were something precious rather than ordinary. "Thank you," he said softly. "Most people only see what I've lost. You notice what I still am." Elena smiled, embarrassed by the compliment. Everyone deserves lunch. She offered the bottle of water and the apple before returning to her bench, with nothing left except the granola bar buried at the bottom of her purse. From across the square she noticed the man bow his head briefly before taking his first bite. He never rushed. He never begged for more. It felt less like charity and more like sharing a table with a stranger whose story had simply taken a different road. Less than half a mile away, inside a quiet black office overlooking the Hudson River, several men in tailored suits watched security footage from dozens of cameras spread across the city. One paused the recording, another leaned closer without speaking. A single image remained frozen on the largest monitor. A young woman handing her lunch to an elderly man. "Interesting," someone murmured. The room fell silent again before the screen went dark. Elena knew nothing about any of it. By 5:30 the sky had turned a deeper shade of blue as office workers poured into crowded sidewalks. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and started the familiar walk toward the subway station. Her paycheck barely covered rent in Queens, student loans, and helping her younger sister through nursing school. Every dollar mattered. Still, she never regretted sharing that sandwich. Kindness had always been the one thing life couldn't tax. Rain began without warning just as she climbed the subway stairs. It wasn't a storm, only a steady drizzle that painted reflections across wet pavement and turned every traffic light into streaks of red and gold. She decided to walk the final 6 blocks home instead of waiting underground with hundreds of strangers. The neighborhood was quieter than Midtown, lined with brick apartment buildings, family diners, and corner stores where everyone recognized familiar faces. Elena stopped briefly outside a small bakery, staring through the window at fresh cinnamon rolls before laughing to herself and continuing home. Rent came first. Treats could wait until payday. At exactly 7:42 that evening, the low growl of an engine disturbed the peaceful street outside her apartment building. Residents glanced through curtains. Children stopped bouncing a basketball near the sidewalk. A long black SUV rolled slowly to the curb with polished paint reflecting every porch light along the block. It didn't belong there. The vehicle looked more suited to the private entrance of a luxury hotel than a modest neighborhood where most people drove 10-year-old sedans. The rear passenger door opened first. 2 men stepped out wearing dark suits that fit with quiet precision rather than flashy wealth. Neither appeared hurried. Neither looked threatening. They simply observed the street with calm professionalism. Elena had just reached the front steps, carrying her umbrella, when she noticed them. Her heartbeat quickened for reasons she couldn't explain. One of the suited men approached with measured steps before stopping several feet away, careful not to invade her space. "Miss Bennett," he asked politely. She nodded slowly. "Someone like to thank you for your kindness today." Confusion crossed her face. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Before the man could answer, another figure emerged from the open rear door of the black SUV. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. The street itself seemed quieter, as neighbors watched from behind curtains without daring to step outside. Elena had never seen him before. At least she was certain she hadn't. Yet the moment his eyes met hers, it felt as though an invisible thread had quietly tightened between two completely different worlds. Unfortunately for her, the lunch she believed she had given away that afternoon had already changed far more than either of them understood. The stranger stopped 3 steps away from Elena, leaving enough distance to show respect, while making it clear that he had come for only one reason. Raindrops rolled from the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat, catching the glow of the apartment building lights. He looked younger than she had expected, perhaps in his middle 30s, with dark hair brushed neatly back and calm green eyes that seemed to notice everything without lingering on any single detail. There was nothing loud about him, no raised voice, no unnecessary movement. Even the 2 suited men behind him remained perfectly still, as though silence itself had become part of their profession. Elena tightened her grip on her umbrella. Every instinct told her this was unusual, yet nothing about the man's behavior felt openly threatening. He offered a polite nod before speaking. "Miss Bennett, I believe you met someone important this afternoon." She searched his face, confused. "I shared my lunch with an older gentleman in the park. If this is about him, I was only trying to help." A faint smile crossed the stranger's face before disappearing almost immediately. "That is exactly why I am here." The words settled between them while the neighborhood remained strangely quiet. Curtains shifted behind nearby windows. A dog barked somewhere farther down the block before everything became still again. Elena glanced toward the black sport utility vehicle parked at the curb. Its polished exterior reflected the wet pavement like dark glass. She had never seen a vehicle quite like it outside her modest apartment building. "Who are you?" she finally asked. The man answered without hesitation. "My name is Adrian Bellini." The name meant nothing to her. She expected him to continue, but instead he reached inside his coat and removed a small white envelope. He held it out carefully. The gentleman wished for this to be delivered personally. Elena accepted it cautiously. Inside rested a handwritten card with only one sentence. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." There was no signature, only elegant handwriting that somehow carried more weight than the expensive stationery itself. "I do not understand," Elena admitted. "Why would someone send all of this because of a sandwich?" Adrian looked toward the street before meeting her eyes again. "Because very few people offered him one." His answer felt simple, almost ordinary, yet it left more questions than it answered. "Is he your father?" she asked. Adrian paused for only a moment. "No." "Your grandfather?" "No." "Then why does this matter so much?" For the first time, his expression softened with something almost resembling amusement. "Because loyalty is not always built through business. Sometimes it begins with a single unexpected gesture." Before Elena could respond, the older superintendent from her building stepped outside carrying a bag of trash. He froze at the sight of the luxury vehicle and the sharply dressed visitors. Adrian stepped aside respectfully, allowing the elderly man to pass without interruption. The superintendent nodded awkwardly before disappearing toward the alley. That single gesture eased a little of Elena's anxiety. Whoever Adrian Bellini truly was, he seemed determined not to intimidate anyone. Less than a mile away, the elderly man from the park sat comfortably inside a quiet townhouse library, no longer wrapped in the worn coat Elena had seen that afternoon. The disguise rested folded across the back of an antique chair. A warm meal waited untouched beside him, while several security monitors displayed live camera feeds from different parts of the city. One screen showed the apartment building where Elena still stood speaking with Adrian. The older man watched silently before lowering his eyes to the empty sandwich wrapper he had carefully saved. "She expected nothing," he murmured to himself. "That is why she deserves everything." Elena remained unaware that anyone was watching. She looked once more at the handwritten card before slipping it into her purse. "Please tell the gentleman he does not owe me anything," she said sincerely. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for my family if they ever needed help." Adrian studied her for a long second, as though memorizing every word. "I will tell him exactly that." He turned toward the waiting vehicle, but stopped before opening the door. "One piece of advice, Miss Bennett." "What is it?" "If anyone asks about tonight, simply tell them someone came to say thank you." "Is there another answer I should give?" His gaze shifted briefly toward the dark skyline before returning to hers. "No." That is the truth. He entered the vehicle. The doors closed with quiet precision, and the black sport utility vehicle disappeared into the rainy evening as smoothly as it had arrived. Elena remained standing beneath the dim porch light until the red taillights vanished around the corner. She convinced herself the strange encounter had ended. Unfortunately for her, someone else had already noticed the visit, and by sunrise the simple act of sharing a lunch would begin changing her life in ways she could not possibly imagine. Sleep never came easily after that evening. Elena Bennett lay awake listening to rain tap softly against her apartment window, while the handwritten card rested on her nightstand beside an old alarm clock. Every few minutes she reached for it again, reading the same sentence as though another message might appear between the elegant lines. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." There was something strangely sincere about it. Something that did not belong in a world where expensive vehicles arrived outside ordinary apartment buildings. By morning the rain had disappeared, leaving the city washed clean beneath pale sunlight. The subway platform buzzed with commuters balancing coffee cups, backpacks, and hurried conversations that blended into one constant wave of sound. Elena stood among them wearing the same navy coat she had owned for 3 winters, replaying the previous night inside her mind. She considered telling her co-workers about the unexpected visitors, but every version of the story sounded unbelievable before she even spoke the first sentence. By 8:30 she was back inside the accounting office where rows of grey cubicles stretched beneath bright ceiling lights. Computers hummed quietly while printers filled the room with their familiar rhythm. Her closest co-worker, Melissa, noticed the distraction almost immediately. "You look like someone offered you $1 million and forgot to tell you where to collect it," she joked. Elena smiled politely. "Just a strange evening." Melissa leaned against the cubicle wall. "Good strange or bad strange?" Elena hesitated. "I honestly cannot tell yet." She changed the subject before more questions followed. Throughout the morning she buried herself in invoices and quarterly reports, grateful for numbers that behaved more predictably than people. Shortly before lunch, the receptionist appeared beside her desk holding a small cream-colored envelope. "This was delivered for you." Elena looked up in surprise. "Who brought it?" "No return address." Curious eyes followed her as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside she found 2 tickets to a charity art exhibition opening that evening at a historic museum on the Upper East Side. Beneath them rested another handwritten note, "No obligation. Consider this an invitation to see how one act of generosity can inspire another." There was still no signature. Melissa stared at the elegant tickets with wide eyes. "Those events are impossible to get into unless you know somebody." Elena folded the note again. "Apparently somebody knows me." Across town, inside a quiet conference room overlooking the river, Adrian Bellini placed a folder onto a polished walnut table. The older gentleman who had accepted Elena's lunch the previous afternoon slowly examined several photographs from the charity exhibition. "She has always volunteered at community events," Adrian explained. "Financial records show regular donation despite a modest income. There are no hidden motives that we can find." The older man nodded thoughtfully before closing the folder. "Continue observing, nothing more." "Should I tell her who you really are?" Adrian asked. The answer came without hesitation. Not yet. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince herself to ignore the invitation. Museums filled with wealthy donors were not part of her life. She owned exactly 1 black dress suitable for formal occasions, and it had not left her closet in nearly 2 years. Yet curiosity lingered long after logic insisted she stay home. By 5 o'clock she found herself unlocking her apartment door with the invitation still tucked inside her purse. Her younger sister, Claire, looked up from the kitchen table where nursing textbooks covered every available inch. "Long day?" she asked. Elena nodded before placing the elegant envelope beside the textbooks. Claire opened it carefully and stared at the tickets. "Please tell me you are going." "That is not what I asked." Elena laughed for the first time since the mysterious visitors had appeared outside their building. "I do not even belong at a place like that." Claire looked directly at her. "Maybe that is exactly why you should go." Less than an hour later, Elena stood in front of her bedroom mirror wearing the simple black dress she had almost forgotten she owned. It was modest, timeless, and far less glamorous than the gowns she imagined other guests would wear. She adjusted a small silver necklace that had belonged to her mother before taking one deep breath. Somewhere across the city, another black sport utility vehicle quietly pulled away from a private townhouse at almost the exact same moment. Neither journey appeared connected, yet both were leading toward the same destination, And before the evening ended, Elena would unknowingly step one level closer to a world she still believed belonged only to strangers. The museum stood beneath the evening sky like a monument preserved from another century, its limestone columns glowing beneath warm lights while sleek black sedans lined the entrance. Elena paused at the bottom of the wide staircase, suddenly aware that almost every guest arriving wore tailored suits or elegant gowns that belonged in glossy magazines rather than ordinary closets. She smoothed the sleeves of her simple black dress, reminding herself that the invitation had been addressed to her by name. If someone wanted her there, perhaps she belonged for one evening. Inside, the grand marble hall echoed with soft piano music and quiet conversations that floated beneath crystal chandeliers. Paintings filled the galleries beyond, each surrounded by guests discussing artists, foundations, and charitable projects. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd carrying sparkling water and delicate hors d'oeuvre. Elena accepted a glass of sparkling water simply to keep her hands occupied. She wandered slowly through the exhibition, stopping longer in front of landscapes than abstract pieces, appreciating colors more than price tags. Every few minutes she noticed someone glance in her direction before politely looking away. It made her wonder whether she had somehow walked into the wrong event after all. Less than one floor above, Adrian Bellini observed the gallery from a private balcony reserved for sponsors. He remained composed, answering brief questions from donors, while occasionally allowing his attention to drift toward the main exhibition hall. The older gentleman who had shared Elena's lunch remained out of sight, seated inside a private reception room connected to the museum through a discreet corridor. "She came," Adrian said quietly. The older man smiled without looking up from the exhibition program resting in his lap. "I believed she would. Should I introduce you now?" Adrian asked. "No," the older man answered calmly. "Tonight is for observation, not revelation." Elena continued through another gallery where black and white photographs captured ordinary moments from neighborhoods across New York City. Children laughing on apartment stoops, firefighters sharing coffee before sunrise, elderly couples walking hand in hand through Central Park. Those images felt more familiar than the luxurious reception surrounding them. She paused in front of one photograph showing a volunteer serving meals beneath a church awning during winter. The caption read, "Compassion leaves footprints that statistics never measure." She smiled quietly. "Beautiful, is it not?" a deep voice asked beside her. Elena turned to find Adrian standing a respectful distance away, dressed in the same understated elegance she had seen outside her apartment. "I did not expect to see you again so soon," she admitted. "Neither did I," Adrian replied with a courteous smile that revealed almost nothing. "Are you enjoying the exhibition?" "More than I expected." He looked toward the photograph. The artist believed that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think nobody is watching. Elena considered that for a moment before asking the question that had followed her since the previous night. "Who is the gentleman I met in the park?" Adrian remained silent long enough to choose his words carefully. "Someone who values character more than appearances." That sounds like an answer without an answer. His faint smile returned. Sometimes those are the safest kind. Before Elena could continue, the museum director approached to greet Adrian personally, thanking him for supporting the charity event. The exchange confirmed what Elena had already suspected. Whoever Adrian represented carried remarkable influence. She quietly stepped away, not wanting to interrupt. As she entered the next gallery, she noticed a framed collection of handwritten letters donated anonymously to the museum. One short note immediately caught her attention. "Kindness is remembered longest by those who expected none." The handwriting looked remarkably familiar. Her heartbeat slowed. She reached into her purse and unfolded the card she had received outside her apartment. The elegant lettering matched almost perfectly. At that exact moment, the older gentleman watched discreetly through a narrow glass panel overlooking the gallery. He saw Elena compare the two pieces of handwriting before gently returning the card to her purse. "She notices details," he observed. Adrian nodded very quickly. "Good," the older man replied. "She will need that gift one day." Elena remained completely unaware of the quiet conversation taking place only a few rooms away. As the evening continued, a string quartet began performing near the center atrium while guests gathered for welcoming remarks. Elena found a place near the back of the audience, comfortable remaining unnoticed. The museum director thanked the donors before announcing that one anonymous benefactor had funded scholarships for dozens of students pursuing careers in education, nursing, and public service. Applause filled the room. No name was given. Elena applauded along with everyone else, never realizing the anonymous donor was already watching the crowd instead of the stage. As the audience slowly dispersed, a museum volunteer approached carrying a small velvet envelope. "Miss Bennett?" Elena nodded. "Someone asked me to give this to you personally." She accepted the envelope with growing curiosity. Inside rested a simple admission pass embossed with gold lettering and a handwritten message consisting of only 6 words. "Tomorrow, noon, the conservatory garden. Come alone." Elena looked up immediately, but the volunteer had already disappeared into the moving crowd, leaving her with far more questions than answers. Elena barely slept after returning from the museum. The small velvet envelope remained on her kitchen table beside an untouched cup of tea that had long since turned cold. Every logical part of her mind insisted that she ignore the invitation. She knew almost nothing about the people behind the handwritten notes, the elegant cards, or the carefully timed appearances. Yet every encounter had been marked by courtesy rather than pressure, generosity rather than demands. By late morning the following day, curiosity quietly outweighed caution. Central Park welcomed visitors beneath a bright autumn sky painted with shades of gold and amber. The conservatory garden rested away from the busiest paths, offering peaceful walkways lined with blooming flowers that somehow refused to surrender to the approaching winter. Elena arrived a few minutes before noon, her footsteps slowing as she crossed the stone entrance. Families wandered through the gardens taking photographs while elderly couples occupied shaded benches beneath towering trees. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, that somehow made the invitation feel even more mysterious. She waited beside a marble fountain where gentle streams of water reflected sunlight across the surrounding pathways. Exactly at noon, Adrian Bellini appeared from the eastern walkway carrying no briefcase, no security detail, and no visible sign of urgency. He wore a navy overcoat instead of the tailored black suit she had seen before, blending surprisingly well with the other visitors enjoying the afternoon. "Thank you for coming," he said warmly. Elena folded her hands together. "I almost did not." That would have been understandable. They began walking slowly through the gardens without any obvious destination. Fallen leaves drifted across the stone paths, while distant laughter echoed from children chasing pigeons beyond the flower beds. Adrian allowed the silence to settle naturally before speaking again. "You have questions," he smiled faintly. "I have more questions than answers. Ask whichever one matters most." She looked directly at him. "Why me?" Adrian considered the question carefully. "Because compassion cannot be purchased. It cannot be negotiated. It reveals itself only when nobody expects recognition." Elena lowered her eyes toward the path. "I only shared my lunch. Most people saw a homeless man." Adrian glanced toward the fountain behind them. "You saw another human being." His answer lingered between them as they continued walking. A gardener waved politely while trimming a row of rose bushes. Adrian returned the greeting with equal respect. Another small gesture that quietly challenged Elena's growing assumptions about him. "Who is he?" she asked again. "The man from the park." Adrian smiled, although this time there was a hint of sadness beneath the expression. "He has spent many years learning whether people value wealth more than character. So he pretends to be homeless." Adrian did not answer immediately. Sometimes truth is easier to discover when no one recognizes your name. Before Elena could ask another question, they reached a secluded section of the garden where a white gazebo overlooked a reflecting pool. An elderly man stood quietly feeding small pieces of bread to several ducks gathered near the water's edge. Elena recognized him immediately. He wore a neatly tailored grey suit instead of the weathered coat from the park, yet his kind blue eyes remained exactly the same. He turned with an easy smile as though greeting an old friend. "Miss Bennett," he said, "thank you for accepting another invitation." Elena stared for a moment before finding her voice. "You are not homeless." "No," he answered gently. "I never was." She looked from him to Adrian, struggling to reconcile the image she had carried since sharing her lunch only 2 days earlier. "Then why?" The older gentleman scattered the last crumbs into the water before facing her completely. "Because titles often become walls. Wealth creates distance. Disguises move both." His words carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty shaped by experience. Elena studied his face. "You wanted to know how people would treat someone who appeared to have nothing." "Exactly." A cool breeze stirred the leaves around them while sunlight shimmered across the pond. Many offered sympathy with their eyes. Very few offered time. Even fewer offered dignity. You never asked whether I deserved your kindness. You simply shared what little you had. Elena felt embarrassed by the attention. It was only lunch. The older man smiled warmly. You keep saying only. I keep remembering enough. At that exact moment, several well-dressed visitors approached from the opposite side of the garden. The moment they noticed the older gentleman, every one of them greeted him respectfully by name. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bellini," one donor said with genuine admiration before continuing along the path. Elena looked slowly toward Adrian, then back to the older man Bellini, the same surname. The realization settled quietly into place. Adrian had never introduced himself as a relative. He had simply never denied the connection. The older gentleman noticed the understanding in her expression and offered a gentle nod. "Yes," he said softly, "Adrian is my son." Before Elena could process that revelation, another black sport utility vehicle rolled silently to the curb outside the garden gates, and the respectful expressions on nearby staff suggested that the Bellini family carried far greater influence than she had imagined. Elena remained silent as the black sport utility vehicle waited beyond the garden gates, its polished exterior barely visible through rows of autumn trees. The discovery that Adrian Bellini was the son of the man she had believed to be homeless had already unsettled every assumption she had made over the previous 2 days. Yet neither father nor son seemed interested in impressing her with wealth. They behaved as though the expensive vehicle, the respectful greetings, and the quiet influence surrounding them were simply ordinary parts of life that required no explanation. Mr. Bellini noticed the uncertainty on Elena's face and gestured toward a nearby bench overlooking the reflecting pool. "Would you sit with us for a few minutes?" he asked. His voice remained calm, almost grandfatherly, carrying none of the authority that others clearly associated with his name. Elena nodded and joined them beneath the shade of an old maple tree whose golden leaves drifted gently onto the stone path. For several moments no one spoke. Ducks glided peacefully across the water while distant laughter echoed from children visiting the park. The silence never felt uncomfortable. Instead, it resembled the kind shared by people who understood that meaningful conversations rarely began in a hurry. "You are wondering why someone with resources would spend an afternoon pretending to have nothing," Mr. Bellini finally said. Elena looked toward the pond before answering honestly. "Yes, I cannot understand it." He smiled softly. "When I was a young man, I believed success meant being recognized everywhere I went. Eventually, I discovered recognition often changes how people behave. Some become overly polite, others become fearful, a few become dishonest because they hope to gain something." Adrian remained quiet, allowing his father to continue without interruption. "Every year," the older man explained, "I spend one day walking through the city as someone the world usually ignores. It reminds me what cannot be learned inside boardrooms or private offices." Elena listened carefully. "And what did you learn this year?" The older gentleman turned toward her with kind blue eyes. "That kindness still exists." The words carried more weight now than they had inside the handwritten note. Elena lowered her gaze, suddenly aware that one ordinary lunch had become part of something much larger than she could have imagined. "You make it sound as though I changed your opinion of people," she said quietly. "Perhaps you reminded me not to lose it," Mr. Bellini answered. Adrian reached into his coat and placed a thin folder on the bench beside Elena. "This is not a gift," he explained before she could misunderstand. "It is simply information." She opened the folder cautiously. Inside she found brochures describing community scholarships, neighborhood food programs, and educational grants funded through the Bellini Foundation. Photographs showed renovated schools, public libraries, children's clinics, and volunteer organizations across New York. There were no photographs of the Bellini family themselves. Every page focused entirely on the people receiving help. "I have never heard of this foundation," Elena admitted. Adrian smiled faintly. "That is intentional." Mr. Bellini folded his hands over the polished cane resting beside him. "Publicity can be useful. Quiet results is often better." Elena slowly turned another page. She recognized one community center only 3 blocks from her apartment, a building that had recently reopened after years of neglect. She had assumed the city funded the renovations. "You paid for this?" she asked. "Many generous people did," Mr. Bellini corrected gently. "I was only one of them." At that exact moment, a young boy chasing a bright red kite stumbled near the pathway. The string slipped from his hands, sending the kite drifting into the branches above. Before anyone else reacted, Mr. Bellini rose carefully from the bench and walked toward the child. Adrian quietly retrieved the kite with the help of a nearby groundskeeper, while the older gentleman knelt just enough to return it personally. The boy smiled with genuine excitement before running back toward his family without ever recognizing the influential man who had helped him. Elena watched the simple exchange with growing admiration. There had been no audience waiting to applaud. No photographers, no speeches, only a quiet act of kindness offered as naturally as sharing a sandwich. As they returned to the bench, Elena realized the greatest surprise was not the Bellini family's wealth. It was how little they seemed interested in displaying it. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the garden while afternoon sunlight reflected across the pond. "Why are you showing me all of this?" Elena finally asked. Mr. Bellini exchanged a brief glance with Adrian before answering. "Because character deserves trust." The answer only deepened the mystery. Before Elena could ask another question, Adrian's phone vibrated softly. He glanced at the screen, his calm expression remaining unchanged. Yet, he slipped the device back into his pocket almost immediately. "We should be going," he said respectfully. Mr. Bellini nodded before turning once more toward Elena. "Would you allow us the privilege of inviting you to lunch next week?" Elena blinked in surprise. "Lunch? A normal lunch," the older gentleman said with a warm smile. "No surprises, no disguises, just a conversation." Elena hesitated for only a moment before smiling back. "I think I would like that." Neither of them noticed the unfamiliar man standing across the street beyond the garden entrance, quietly observing the meeting before disappearing into the afternoon crowd with a thoughtful expression that suggested Elena's unexpected connection to the Bellini family had not gone entirely unnoticed. The invitation stayed with Elena throughout the following week in ways she had not expected. It was not simply the promise of lunch. It was the growing realization that every conversation with the Bellini family had quietly challenged the assumptions she had carried for years about wealth, influence, and generosity. Monday morning arrived with bright sunshine stretching across Manhattan as if the city itself had forgotten the rain that had started everything. Elena settled back into the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets, invoices, and ringing office telephones, yet every ordinary moment now seemed slightly different. During lunch, she found herself walking once again toward the small public square where she had first shared her sandwich. The same fountain sparkled beneath the afternoon light. The same benches overlooked streams of hurried pedestrians, yet the older man was no longer there. Instead, she noticed several volunteers arranging folding tables covered with baskets of fresh bread, fruit, bottled water, and warm meals. Curious, she approached one of the women organizing the event. "Is this a community program?" Elena asked. The volunteer smiled warmly. "It is our first day here. Someone donated enough funding to provide lunches every weekday through the winter." Elena looked around at the growing line of people gathering quietly without pushing or shouting. Everything had been organized with remarkable dignity. Nobody was being treated as a charity case. Every person was greeted with a smile and offered a choice rather than leftovers. "Who sponsored this?" she asked. The volunteer laughed softly. "Anonymous donor. They insisted the attention stay on the people being served." Elena lowered her eyes with a knowing smile. She already suspected the answer. Less than 2 blocks away, Adrian Bellini stood inside a nearby coffee shop watching through the front window. He wore an ordinary wool coat and blended easily among the lunchtime crowd. He noticed Elena speaking with the volunteers before quietly turning away without interrupting her. His phone vibrated once. A brief message appeared on the screen. "Did she come?" Adrian typed a simple reply. "She found the project on her own. Across the city." Mr. Bellini smiled as he read the message before placing his phone face down beside a stack of foundation reports. "Good," he whispered. "Let compassion introduce itself." Elena spent nearly an hour helping distribute meals before returning to work slightly late. Her manager glanced at the clock but said nothing after noticing the content expression she rarely wore on Monday afternoons. That evening she visited her sister Claire at the kitchen table once again surrounded by nursing textbooks. "You seem happier lately," Claire observed. Elena poured 2 cups of tea before answering. "I met people who remind me that doing good does not always need applause." Claire leaned forward with curiosity. "The same family," Elena nodded. "They keep showing me things instead of telling me who they are." Claire smiled thoughtfully. "Sometimes actions explain people better than biographies." Thursday finally arrived. At exactly 12 noon, Elena stood outside a quiet Italian restaurant overlooking the East River. It was elegant without being extravagant, tucked away from crowded tourist streets, and known more for its peaceful atmosphere than public attention. Adrian greeted her at the entrance with the same calm professionalism she had come to expect. "Thank you for accepting our invitation," he said. "I almost brought flowers," Elena replied with an embarrassed laugh. "Then I realized this was only lunch." Adrian smiled. "My father would have appreciated the thought." Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the water where ferries moved slowly between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Mr. Bellini stood as Elena approached the table, greeting her not with formality, but with genuine warmth. "I hope you arrived hungry," he said. "Very," Elena admitted. The meal unfolded with surprising simplicity. They discussed favorite books, neighborhood bakeries, childhood memories, and the changing seasons in New York. No one mentioned business. No one discussed money. Adrian occasionally joined the conversation before politely stepping away to answer brief phone calls, always returning without disrupting the relaxed atmosphere. Halfway through lunch, the restaurant owner personally visited their table carrying a fresh dessert that had not been ordered. "For our favorite guest," he told Mr. Bellini, "you have helped this neighborhood more than you realize." Mr. Bellini thanked him quietly before introducing Elena by name. The owner shook her hand warmly. "Anyone welcomed by this family must have a remarkable heart." Elena felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She still struggled to understand why such extraordinary with one ordinary act. As lunch drew to a close, Mr. Bellini reached into his jacket and removed a small leather notebook. "There is something I have wanted to ask you," he said gently. Elena looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What is it?" He rested the notebook on the table, but did not open it. "If someone offered you the chance to help thousands of people instead of one, would you accept before knowing every detail?" The question settled over the table like the calm surface of the river beyond the windows. Elena looked from the notebook to Adrian and then back to Mr. Bellini. Unaware that her answer would quietly determine whether she was about to step into the greatest secret the Bellini family had protected for decades, Elena did not answer immediately. The question lingered between the three of them while afternoon sunlight shimmered across the East River beyond the restaurant windows. She looked at the small leather notebook resting on the table, then back at Mr. Bellini. His expression held neither expectation nor pressure. It was simply the patient look of someone willing to accept whatever answer came honestly. "I would need to know one thing first," she said at last. "Would those people be helped with dignity, or would they become someone else's success story?" A quiet smile spread across the older man's face. Adrian lowered his eyes for a brief moment as though the answer had settled something important long before either of them spoke. Mr. Bellini gently opened the notebook and turned it toward Elena. Instead of financial statements or legal documents, every page contained handwritten names, small photographs, and short notes describing ordinary people whose lives had quietly changed through scholarships, medical assistance, neighborhood programs, and educational grants. There were teachers who had remained in struggling schools because classrooms had been renovated, nurses whose tuition had been paid anonymously, small business owners who had rebuilt after devastating setbacks. None of the entries mentioned the Bellini family. Every story focused entirely on the people who had moved forward. "This is not a record of what we have given. It is a reminder of why we continue." Elena carefully turned another page. Several names had stars beside them. "What do these mean?" she asked. "Those are people who eventually return to help someone else," Adrian answered. "Kindness has a remarkable way of multiplying when it is offered without conditions." Elena slowly closed the notebook, her fingers resting lightly on its worn leather cover. "Then my answer is yes," she said. "If helping people always comes before recognition, I would gladly be part of something like that." Relief quietly crossed Mr. Bellini's face. "That is all I hope to hear." Their lunch continued without ceremony. They discussed volunteer organizations throughout New York, neighborhood libraries, public gardens, and community centers where simple improvements had transformed entire blocks. Elena realized the Bellini Foundation approached generosity the same way careful gardeners approached neglected soil. They planted patiently, asked for nothing in return, and allowed others to bloom. When the meal ended, they stepped outside into bright afternoon sunshine. A cool breeze carried the scent of the river while ferries crossed slowly toward Brooklyn. Adrian opened the rear passenger door of the familiar black sport utility vehicle, but before anyone entered, Mr. Bellini turned toward Elena once more. "Would you allow me to show you one final place today?" he asked. "Of course," Elena replied. The drive lasted less than 20 minutes, carrying them away from luxury hotels and financial towers into a quiet neighborhood filled with brick buildings, playgrounds, and tree-lined streets. The vehicle eventually stopped in front of a renovated community center whose cheerful murals covered nearly every exterior wall. Children played basketball nearby while parents gathered on shaded benches talking comfortably with one another. Laughter filled the warm afternoon air. Elena stepped from the vehicle and immediately recognized the building from one of the brochures Adrian had shown her in Central Park. Inside, classrooms buzzed with activity. Teenagers received tutoring. Senior citizens attended computer classes. Volunteers prepared evening meals in a spotless kitchen. Music drifted through another room where young children practiced with donated instruments. No expensive decorations filled the halls. Every dollar had clearly been invested into people instead of appearances. The center director welcomed Mr. Bellini warmly before greeting Elena with equal kindness. "We have heard wonderful things about you," she said. Elena blinked in surprise. "You have?" The director laughed softly. "A person who shares lunch with a stranger without expecting thanks is exactly the kind of volunteer every neighborhood hopes to find." Elena glanced toward Adrian, who merely smiled without offering an explanation. Less than a mile away, the unfamiliar man who had quietly observed the Bellini family days earlier sat inside a parked stand reviewing several photographs. One image showed Elena distributing meals with volunteers. Another captured her walking beside Adrian through the conservatory garden. He closed the folder without speaking, his thoughtful expression revealing curiosity rather than hostility. Whatever interest he held in the Bellini family had now quietly expanded to include the young accountant whose ordinary compassion seemed to open extraordinary doors. Back inside the community center, Elena joined several volunteers serving afternoon snacks to children arriving after school. No one treated her like a guest. Within minutes she felt as though she had belonged there for years. Mr. Bellini watched from across the room, saying nothing while a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him. Adrian approached his father near the entrance. "You were right," he said softly. "She never changed once she understood who we were." Mr. Bellini looked toward Elena as she knelt beside a little girl struggling to tie her shoelaces before helping her with gentle patience. "No," he replied. "She simply became more herself." As the sun slowly lowered beyond the neighborhood rooftops, Elena realized that every unexpected invitation had been leading her toward this place, and although she still believed she was only discovering a generous family, she remained completely unaware that the greatest truth about the Bellini name had yet to be revealed. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in clear blue skies and crisp autumn air, yet Elena found herself thinking less about the Bellini family and more about the children she had met at the community center. Throughout the week she had returned twice after work, helping organize donated books, serving evening meals, and assisting younger students with mathematics homework. Nobody had asked her to come back. Nobody had expected anything from her. Somehow that made the invitation feel even more meaningful. She had become part of something because she wanted to, not because anyone had persuaded her. As she stacked art supplies inside one of the classrooms, the center director approached carrying a folder filled with handwritten thank you letters from local families. "I thought you might enjoy reading these," she said with a warm smile. Elena opened the folder carefully. Every page carried simple stories written in different handwriting. A single mother thanked the center for providing after-school tutoring that allowed her to keep working full-time. An elderly veteran expressed gratitude for computer classes that helped him reconnect with distant grandchildren. A teenager described earning a college scholarship after receiving free mentoring for nearly 2 years. None of the letters mentioned the Bellini name. Every writer believed the center simply existed because people cared enough to keep it alive. Elena closed the folder with quiet admiration. "They never tell anyone who made this possible," she said. The director nodded. "That was always Mr. Bellini's condition." Elena looked up. "You have known him for a long time, almost 20 years, the director replied. "He believes the strongest foundations are built where nobody notices the person laying the stones." Those words stayed with Elena long after she returned home that evening. Across Manhattan, inside a private office overlooking the skyline, Adrian Bellini reviewed reports from several community projects while his father stood beside a large window, watching the city lights appear one building at a time. "She volunteered again today," Adrian said, "without receiving another invitation." Mr. Bellini smiled faintly. That is because she believes the work matters more than the people who introduced her to it. Adrian closed the folder in front of him. There is still one truth she does not know, and she is almost ready to hear it. The older man replied quietly, not because she trusts us, because she now trusts what she has seen with her own eyes. The following afternoon, Elena received another handwritten note delivered through the receptionist at her office. It contained only a location, a time, and one sentence. There is one chapter still missing. If you wish to understand everything, meet us tomorrow evening. She folded the note carefully before placing it inside her purse, beside the first card she had received days earlier. Curiosity had gradually replaced uncertainty. For the first time since the unexpected lunch in the park, she realized she was no longer asking whether she should trust the Bellini family. Instead, she wondered what burden they had been carrying that required so much patience before revealing it. Monday evening arrived beneath a sky glowing orange as the sun disappeared beyond the Hudson River. Adrian met her outside a beautifully restored brick building tucked between two historic churches on a quiet Manhattan street. There were no signs identifying the place. No security guards stood outside. It looked more like an old library than a corporate headquarters. "Where are we?" Elena asked. Adrian opened the heavy wooden door with a respectful smile. "Somewhere very few people are invited. Inside." Polished oak floors stretched beneath warm lighting, while shelves filled with journals, photographs, and carefully preserved documents lined the walls. Portraits of volunteers, teachers, doctors, firefighters, and community leaders decorated the hallways instead of wealthy donors or executives. Elena slowly walked through the gallery, noticing decades of neighborhood history preserved with extraordinary care. One photograph stopped her completely. It showed a much younger Mr. Bellini standing beside volunteers distributing food after a devastating winter storm nearly 30 years earlier. He wore ordinary work clothes, carried heavy boxes himself, and smiled exactly as he did now. "He has been doing this for decades," Elena whispered. Adrian nodded, long before most people knew his name. They entered a quiet reading room where Mr. Bellini waited beside a fireplace with 2 cups of tea already prepared. He invited Elena to sit before placing an old newspaper clipping on the table between them. The faded headline described the sudden disappearance of one of New York City's most influential business figures nearly 30 years earlier. Elena looked from the article to the older man in confusion. "I do not understand," she admitted. Mr. Bellini rested his hands on the newspaper before speaking with calm honesty. "Because that article was written about me." Elena read the headline again, her eyes widening as the pieces began shifting into place. The mysterious disguises, the anonymous generosity, the carefully protected privacy. She had believed she was slowly getting to know a wealthy philanthropist. Instead, she was beginning to discover that the public story surrounding the Bellini family had never been the complete one. And the truth waiting beyond that newspaper clipping would change everything she thought she knew about the man who had first accepted half of her lunch on a quiet autumn afternoon. Elena carefully lifted the yellowed newspaper clipping, afraid that even the lightest touch might damage a piece of history that had clearly been preserved for decades. The headline spoke about the sudden disappearance of a respected businessman whose charitable projects had unexpectedly come to a halt almost 30 years earlier. Beneath the article was a photograph of a much younger Mr. Bellini, standing in front of a modest community center with the same gentle smile she had come to recognize. "You disappeared," Elena said quietly, looking from the article to the man sitting across from her. At least that is what everyone believed. Mr. Bellini nodded slowly. "That is exactly what the newspapers reported." The fireplace crackled softly beside them while evening shadows stretched across the old reading room. Adrian remained silent, allowing his father to tell the story in his own time. "The truth," Mr. Bellini continued, "was much less dramatic than people imagined. I stepped away because I realized my name had become louder than the work itself. Every donation created headlines. Every project became another opportunity for publicity. The people we hoped to help slowly became background characters in stories that were supposed to celebrate generosity." Elena listened without interrupting. "So you vanished on purpose?" "From public life," he answered. "Not from the neighborhoods that still needed help." He reached toward another shelf and removed a thick leather scrapbook filled with photographs. Elena opened it carefully. The first pages showed community gardens, renovated schools, health clinics, libraries, and after-school programs stretching across 3 decades. In every photograph, Mr. Bellini appeared only as another volunteer carrying boxes, painting walls, planting flowers, or serving meals. Sometimes Adrian appeared beside him as a teenager. Sometimes neither of them appeared at all. "You never stopped," Elena whispered. "We simply stopped asking anyone to notice," Adrian replied. Elena slowly turned another page and recognized children from the community center she had recently visited. Several of the youngest faces had now grown into adults who were volunteering beside a new generation. "These are the stars from your notebook," she realized. Mr. Bellini smiled warmly. "People who received kindness and later chose to give it away." Elena closed the scrapbook and looked thoughtfully around the quiet room. Every wall displayed stories of ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things together. There were no portraits celebrating the Bellini family. No awards stood inside polished glass cases. Even the foundation's name appeared only in small print tucked into the corners of old photographs. "Why tell me now?" she asked. "Because trust grows stronger when it is built on truth," Mr. Bellini answered. "You deserve to know why we found your simple act of kindness so meaningful." Adrian stepped toward a large framed map hanging nearby. Colored pins marked hundreds of locations across New York City. "Every pin represents a project still operating today," he explained. "Food programs, educational centers, housing assistance, job training, libraries, neighborhood clinics, scholarships." Elena studied the map with growing amazement. The colored markers stretched across nearly every borough. "This is far bigger than I imagined." "It has taken many years," Adrian said quietly. "And many people less than a mile away." The unfamiliar observer who had quietly followed the Bellini family's charitable work parked outside another neighborhood center before placing several photographs into a sealed envelope. He looked once toward the building where children laughed beneath bright lights before driving away without speaking to anyone. Whatever questions had first drawn him toward the Bellini family seemed to be changing into something else entirely. Back inside the reading room, Mr. Bellini carefully folded the old newspaper clipping and returned it to its protective sleeve. "History often remembers public victories," he said. "Very rarely does it remember quiet compassion." Elena smiled gently. "Maybe that is because quiet compassion is never trying to be remembered." The older man looked at her with unmistakable pride. "Exactly." A clock somewhere deeper inside the building chimed 7 times. Adrian checked his watch before looking toward his father. "The board members have already arrived." Elena glanced between them with curiosity. "Board members?" Mr. Bellini stood and offered her a reassuring smile. "There is one final part of this story that you have not yet seen." He walked toward a pair of tall wooden doors at the end of the hallway and paused before opening them. Warm conversation drifted through the narrow opening along with the sound of chairs moving across polished floors. "For many years," he said softly, "people believe this foundation belonged to one family. Tonight you will discover who has truly carried it forward." Elena stepped beside him, unaware that the room waiting beyond those doors would forever change the way she understood generosity, leadership, and the remarkable legacy quietly built by people who had never asked the world to learn their names. Elena stepped through the tall wooden doors, expecting to find a formal board meeting filled with executives in expensive suits discussing financial reports and investment strategies. Instead, she entered a warm room alive with quiet conversation and genuine laughter. Long wooden tables stretched beneath soft lighting, covered not with contracts but with photographs, handwritten letters, neighborhood maps, and children's drawings. Men and women of every age stood together sharing stories over coffee. Some wore business attire while others arrived directly from classrooms, hospitals, construction sites, or volunteer centers. What united them was not wealth but purpose. The conversations paused only long enough for Mr. Bellini to enter. Instead of applause, every person greeted him with the easy familiarity for an old friend. Several embraced him warmly, others simply smiled with unmistakable respect. Elena quickly realized she was not witnessing an organization built around authority. She was witnessing a family that had chosen one another through years of service. "Everyone," Mr. Bellini said with quiet pride, "this is Elena Bennett." Dozens of welcoming smiles turned toward her. Before she could feel overwhelmed, an elderly school principal stepped forward and shook her hand. "We have heard about the sandwich," she said with a gentle laugh. Elena blinked in surprise. "Everyone knows? Only because it reminded all of us how this journey began," another volunteer explained. Adrian watched Elena's expression soften as she moved naturally through the room, speaking with teachers, nurses, firefighters, social workers, librarians, and neighborhood organizers. Every conversation revealed another chapter in a story she had only recently begun to understand. A retired firefighter described how anonymous grants had rebuilt a youth center after a devastating winter storm. A pediatric nurse explained how scholarships had allowed dozens of students to enter medical professions without crushing debt. A local baker proudly shared how his small business now donated fresh bread every morning to community kitchens after receiving help years earlier when he had almost lost everything. None of them spoke about what they had received. They spoke about what they were now able to give. Elena noticed a large framed photograph hanging near the center of the room. Hundreds of volunteers stood together outside the very community center she had recently visited. At first she searched instinctively for Mr. Bellini or Adrian among the crowd. It took her nearly a minute to find them because they stood in the back row rather than the front. "You always hide yourselves," she said quietly when Adrian joined her beside the photograph. He smiled. "The photograph belongs to everyone else. Most organizations would place the founders in the center." Adrian looked toward the volunteers filling the room. "My father believes leaders should leave enough space for others to be seen." At that exact moment the room gradually grew quiet as Mr. Bellini stood near the fireplace holding a simple wooden box no larger than an old family photo album. He opened it carefully before removing dozens of folded notes tied together with faded ribbon. "Many years ago," he began, "we made a promise that every act of kindness entrusted to this foundation would begin with one question. Will this help someone stand on their own?" He unfolded one of the oldest notes. This was written by a single mother nearly 30 years ago after receiving enough support to finish nursing school. She supervises an emergency department and has mentored more than 200 young nurses. He selected another letter. This came from a teenager who believed college would always remain beyond reach. Last spring he opened his own engineering firm and now funds scholarships for students he has never met. Elena listened as story after story unfolded. None celebrated miracles. Everyone celebrated opportunity. Every success had grown from ordinary people refusing to let someone else's difficult season define the rest of their life. Less than a mile away, the man who had quietly observed the Bellini family for days parked outside the building one final time. He looked through several photographs before removing them from the envelope and placing them into a nearby recycling bin. Without another glance toward the building, he started the engine and drove away into the evening traffic. Whatever uncertainty had first brought him there had disappeared. Inside, Mr. Bellini gently closed the wooden box before looking directly at Elena. "A week ago," he said, "you believed you had shared half of a simple lunch with a stranger. In truth, you reminded an old man why he started walking the city anonymously every year." Elena felt emotion rise quietly in her chest. "I never imagined any of this. That is precisely why your kindness mattered," he replied. "It arrived without calculation." He then reached into his jacket and removed the same handwritten card she had first received outside her apartment. "I would like you to keep this forever," he said, "not as a reminder of meeting us, but as a reminder that one ordinary afternoon can quietly redirect an entire life." Elena accepted the card with careful hands, while everyone in the room watched in respectful silence. She believed the evening had reached its emotional conclusion. She did not yet realize that Mr. Bellini had prepared one final invitation, one that would ask her not simply to remember this remarkable week, but to help shape everything the foundation would become in the years ahead. The room remained quiet long after Mr. Bellini placed the handwritten card into Elena's hands. She looked around at the faces surrounding her and realized that every person present had once stood at a crossroads much like her own. Some had first arrived needing help, others had come searching for purpose. Every one of them had stayed because they discovered that generosity became stronger when it was shared. Mr. Bellini waited until the silence settled naturally before speaking again. "There is one final favor I would like to ask," he said gently. Elena looked up from the card. "If I can help, I will." He smiled with unmistakable warmth. "That answer is exactly why I am asking." Adrian stepped toward a nearby cabinet and carefully removed a slim folder bearing no corporate logo or official seal. He placed it on the table without opening it. "This is not an employment contract," he explained. "It is not a legal obligation or a financial proposal." Elena looked at the folder with quiet curiosity. "Then what is it?" Mr. Bellini folded his hands together before answering. "For many years this foundation has relied on people who understand numbers. organization, and responsibility. We have accountants, attorneys, educators, physicians, and volunteers from every profession. What we cannot teach is character. Elena listened carefully. We would like you to become one of our volunteer advisors, Adrian continued. Only a few hours each week. Help us review scholarship applications, recommend neighborhood projects, and ensure every dollar reaches the people who need it most. Elena blinked in surprise. You trust me with something that important? Mr. Bellini smiled. No. We trust the woman who shared her lunch before she knew anyone was watching. Those words settled gently into her heart. She slowly opened the folder. Instead of complicated documents, she found handwritten letters from students hoping to attend college, families applying for emergency assistance, neighborhood leaders proposing after-school programs, and volunteers requesting support for community gardens. Every application represented a real life waiting for someone to believe in possibility. You would help us read these, Adrian said quietly. Not to decide who deserves kindness, because everyone does. You would simply help us understand where kindness can create the greatest opportunity. Elena turned another page, her eyes lingering on the careful handwriting of a young nursing student working 2 jobs while caring for her grandmother. The story reminded her so much of Claire that emotion quietly filled her voice. I would be honored. A wave of gentle smiles spread across the room. Nobody applauded, nobody celebrated dramatically. It felt less like someone joining an organization and more like another chair quietly being added to a family table. During the following weeks, Elena settled naturally into her new role. She continued working full-time at the accounting office while spending several evenings each week reviewing scholarship applications and visiting neighborhood programs. Adrian often accompanied her to meetings, introducing her not through titles but through stories of the people whose lives had already changed. Their conversations gradually became easier, filled with laughter over simple meals, long walks through city parks, and thought how small decisions could reshape entire communities. Elena noticed that Adrian never interrupted others, always remembered names, and somehow managed to make every volunteer feel important regardless of age or background. She began to understand that quiet leadership had been part of his life for far longer than expensive suits or polished boardrooms. One crisp Saturday morning, they returned together to the small public square where everything had begun. The lunchtime food program now welcomed dozens of visitors every day. Volunteers greeted familiar faces by name while children colored pictures at folding tables beside the fountain. Elena stood beside Adrian, watching an elderly man accept a warm meal with grateful eyes. Do you ever miss the disguises? She asked softly. Adrian smiled toward the crowd. My father says he never stopped wearing one. Elena looked at him curiously. What does he mean? He believes the greatest disguise is allowing kindness to receive the credit instead of the person offering it. She smiled quietly, understanding at last. Less than a mile away, Mr. Bellini watched the same scene from a nearby park bench, dressed once again in his old weathered coat. This time he was not testing strangers or searching for proof that compassion still existed. He simply enjoyed watching the neighborhood he loved continue helping itself. Several people recognized him only as another older gentleman enjoying the afternoon sunshine. That anonymity brought him peace. As the afternoon light reflected across the fountain, Elena reached into her purse and unfolded the handwritten card she had carried since the evening the black sport utility vehicle first appeared outside her apartment. The ink had begun to fade slightly along the edges from being opened so many times, yet the message remained perfectly clear. She smiled before carefully returning it to its place. Adrian noticed the familiar card and asked quietly, "Do you still read it?" Elena nodded. "Whenever I need to remember that ordinary days can change everything." Adrian looked toward the volunteers sharing meals beneath the autumn trees. Sometimes they do. Neither of them realized that Mr. Bellini was watching from across the square with quiet gratitude, knowing the final chapter of the story he had hoped to write was already unfolding exactly as he had dreamed many years before. Nearly 1 year passed before Elena fully understood how profoundly a single afternoon could reshape an ordinary life. The seasons turned quietly across New York City. Winter wrapped the streets in pale morning frost before giving way to spring blossoms in neighborhood parks and finally the warm sunlight of another autumn. Yet one thing never changed. Every weekday at noon, volunteers gathered in the same public square where a young accountant had once shared half of her lunch with a stranger who appeared to have nothing. The folding tables had become a familiar part of the neighborhood. Fresh meals, books, Blankets during colder months and smiling volunteer without questions or judgment. Elena no longer arrived as a visitor. She arrived carrying boxes, greeting regular guests by name, and organizing new volunteers who wanted to help. Her evenings remained divided between her accounting career and the Bellini Foundation, but the work never felt like an obligation. It had become part of who she was. Claire completed nursing school with the encouragement of the scholarship programs Elena had helped strengthen. Several students whose applications Elena had personally reviewed proudly sent graduation photographs to the foundation. Community gardens flourished in neighborhoods that had once been forgotten. Small businesses that received quiet assistance now donated food, supplies, and time to others beginning difficult journeys of their own. The cycle Mr. Bellini had described continued growing exactly as he had hoped. Kindness multiplied because people believed in passing it forward, rather than paying it back. Adrian and Elena gradually discovered that the strongest relationships are often built long before either person notices them. Their conversations no longer centered only on projects and volunteer schedules. They explored bookstores on quiet Sunday mornings, walked through Central Park after foundation meetings, and shared simple dinners where neither one felt the need to impress the other. Adrian admired that Elena treated every person with the same warmth regardless of position or influence. Elena admired that Adrian carried remarkable responsibility without allowing it to harden his character. There were no dramatic declarations, no grand displays intended for an audience. Their affection grew naturally, patiently, through shared purpose and quiet trust. One crisp October afternoon, Mr. Bellini invited them to the community center that had become one of the foundation's earliest success stories. Children hurried through bright hallways carrying backpacks while volunteers prepared another evening meal in the kitchen. Laughter echoed from classrooms where tutors helped students finish homework before music lessons began. The building felt alive in the best possible way. Mr. Bellini paused beside the entrance and looked around with contentment. "This," he said softly, "was always the dream, not buildings, not foundations, people choosing one another." He turned toward Elena with gentle pride. "When I first met you, I wondered whether compassion could still surprise me. Instead, it reminded me why I never stopped believing." Elena smiled as she reached into her purse and removed the now well-worn handwritten card that had remained with her every day since that unforgettable week. The edges had softened with time, but the message remained perfectly readable. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." She carefully handed it back to Mr. Bellini. He looked at it for a long moment before quietly shaking his head. "It belongs to you now. It changed my life," Elena admitted. "No," he replied with a warm smile. "Your decision changed your life. The card only reminded you of it." Adrian reached for Elena's hand, and this time she accepted it without hesitation. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Around them, children laughed. Volunteers served meals, teachers encouraged students, and neighbors greeted one another like old friends. Every sound reflected the quiet legacy built through thousands of ordinary choices made by ordinary people who refused to walk past someone in need. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, Mr. Bellini slipped away unnoticed and walked alone toward the familiar public square. He wore the same weathered coat he had worn on the day Elena first met him. He sat on the same old bench overlooking the fountain, watching office workers hurry past with briefcases, coffee cups, and crowded schedules. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. He was simply another older man enjoying the cool autumn air. After several peaceful minutes, a young college student carrying a paper lunch bag slowed, hesitated, and walked toward him with a shy smile. "Sir," she said gently, "I packed a little extra today. Would you like to share?" Mr. Bellini accepted the sandwich with both hands exactly as he had 1 year earlier. His grateful smile carried no surprise, only quiet hope fulfilled. Across the plaza, Elena happened to glance toward the old bench and recognized the familiar scene unfolding beneath the golden leaves. She did not interrupt. She simply smiled through grateful eyes as Adrian quietly joined her side. Together they watched another stranger choose compassion without expecting recognition, reward, or applause. The city continued moving around them, unaware that the smallest act of kindness had once again begun a story no one could yet imagine. And beneath the soft light of another autumn afternoon, the same fountain shimmered exactly as it had on the day everything changed, proving that sometimes the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is not a name carved into stone, but a kindness quietly repeated by someone they may never even meet.